If you enjoyed the channel and our video content and would like to support us, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can sign up to our Patreon site, which is a monthly subscription to one of our 4 tiers, each giving you something different from early access interviews up to exclusive unseen footage. There's also the option of a one-off donation via PayPal, which allows you the option to donate an amount of your choice. Both options really help to keep this channel going and to continue putting out regular content for you good folk. So please take a look at aircrewinterview.tv/donate, and I thank you in advance. Thank you and enjoy. And then you became like a civilian air observer. Tell us how this happened, because it fascinates me, like how you went from the Nimrod to Suffolk Police.
Sheer dumb luck. That's how it worked. When I left the Air Force, I had several proper jobs, but they never really suited me.
Yeah.
And I saw a job advertised to work in the control room for Suffolk Police. Mm-hmm. So answering the 999 calls, sending police officers out to jobs and that kind of thing. And I thought that sounded better than doing paperwork and filing and that kind of thing. So I applied for that. And fairly soon after I arrived in the control room, Suffolk made the decision that they were going to buy a helicopter.
Right.
Up until that point, they hadn't had a helicopter. So I started annoying the HR department with letters on a sort of weekly basis, saying, is it going to be civilians? Is it going to be civilians? And it started up in September 2000, and all of the observers were police officers, as they were at most units throughout the country. Now, our chief constable at the time, when he decided that he was getting a helicopter, went and flew with some other units around the country to get an idea of how they used the helicopter. Mm-hmm. And he went to fly with one unit, and because it was the chief constable coming along, they didn't send just any copper to fly with them. They sent the unit executive officer and the deputy unit executive officer and the chief pilot out to fly with him and answer any questions. And they're flying along, and our chief constable said, "So you're both civilians then, are you?" And they said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Does that cause any problems?" "No, sir." "Right, we're having 2 of those as well then." What they failed to point out to him was that the unit executive officer had been a police officer for 30 years, retired as an inspector running the air support unit on a Friday, and had come back in a civilian suit on the Monday to carry on.
Right.
The deputy had done a similar thing but retired as a sergeant. So they were both 30-year police officers. They just happened to be civilians. But they didn't mention that to him, and he'd made his mind up he was going to have 2 civilians. So he opened it up to 2 civilians, and I was one of those that applied.
Yeah, and obviously, did your military background help you going for that position?
That is absolutely what I tried to convince them of in the interview. Yeah. I'm not sure that it did very much, apart from the fact that I was used to operating in the air, so I didn't have to think about that. I didn't have to think about the third dimension. I didn't have to feel uncomfortable operating in the air, because that's what I was used to do. And I'd been a private pilot since 1986 on and off anyway. So, I was used to navigating and maps and radios and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you actually tell us the role of a civilian air observer with the police? What does that entail?
Exactly the same as a police officer does, apart from the fact that if you happen to land, you can't arrest anybody on suspicion of committing a crime.
Yeah.
So there are 2 observers on police aircraft, 1 pilot and 2 observers. One of the observers sits next to the pilot and is generally the one in communication with the control room, getting all the information, helping the pilot with checklists and bits and pieces, and obviously lookout and things like that, and operating the camera and thermal imaging equipment when you get to wherever your task is. In the rear is the sort of mission commander, for want of a better idea. So the person who decides where you go, what tactics you use, but also does all the navigation and so on. And then when you get to your task, they'll be the person liaising with any officers on the ground,
Right.
To move them around. And
Yeah, so let's talk a bit about your flying training, because I'm guessing did you go straight to is it the EC-135, or was there a basic helicopter you went on before that?
Well, we did our training at the International Police Air Training School, which sounds very grand.
That sounds very posh, doesn't it?
It was basically one bloke at Gloucester Airport, a chap called Rick Newson, who taught us everything. So he'd teach us stuff on the ground, and then he'd take us out to the helicopter and fly us and teach us it practice it in the helicopter, and he did everything with us and it was just a 2-week course. Mm-hmm. So we did that mainly on squirrels. There was one trip on an old Volco 105, but it was mainly squirrels. So we did the basic training for an air observer there, and then we went back to our individual units, because there were 6 of us on the course, 2 from West Yorkshire, I think it was, or somewhere in Yorkshire, 2 from Cambridgeshire, and the 2 of us from Suffolk. And we went back to our units then and learned how to use the kit on our aircraft and the local procedures and so on.
Mm-hmm. And was the 135, was it just, how many crew could it actually hold? I'm guessing a pilot, 2 in the front, was it 2 in the back, seat-wise?
There were 2 seats in the back, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could re-roll it and put other seats in, but because of the police roll equipment and the kind of fuel that we carried, 3 up was generally what we flew. You could squeeze in a 4th if they were the right sort of size.
Mm-hmm. And did you get any air sickness when you went to helicopters? Because it's probably a bit different coming from the Nimrod.
I've never had any air sickness.
Wow. Okay.
In anything, I've always been quite lucky there. Never been a problem for me.
So yeah, obviously going through your training and going to the civilian world, how did it compare coming from the RAF, which is probably a bit more strict? I'm not sure, but that kind of regimented. Was it similar on the civilian side with the police force?
It was, because obviously the police is a disciplined organisation as well. Most of our pilots were ex-forces. Majority of them ex-Army Air Corps, but some ex-Air Force and some ex-Navy as well. But the majority were Army Air Corps. And several of the police officers were ex-forces as well. So
it's like a natural progression, I suppose, if you come from the forces. And how did it work with the guys who were ex-military like yourself, with people just coming from a civilian background? Was it easy to get on? Because I'm always fascinated with that, because I've talked to lots of military guys, and they're very just they got one mindset. It's just okay, but civilians are a bit more chatty. How does that work?
No, I think because the police is a disciplined service, and the pilots, as I say, were all ex-military, so the stuff we did in the aircraft when we had a job to do was quite disciplined and process-led. I don't think it was ever a problem. And you were there to do a police job. Yeah. You weren't there. You just happened to be in a helicopter. You just happened to be in the sky because that was the best place to do it from. You were there to do a police job.
And I want you to tell our viewers, what was a typical day like? Because I can imagine there was some crazy stuff that went up on there.
Yeah, there were no typical days, which was the best thing about it. But we had 2 shifts. One that started in the morning. It varied, but either 8 or 9 o'clock or something like that, and run through till about 5. And then we ran through from 5 until 2:30 in the morning. And then when I was doing it, there was a gap between 2:30 and 9 in the morning, because there just wasn't the volume of jobs to justify having a helicopter. So there were those 2 shifts. But you would turn up and you would have no idea what was coming up. So on a day shift, you check that the fuel was okay, the pilot checked that the aircraft was okay, you'd check anything from the previous night, any intelligence that you had, any jobs that were coming up that you had to do, or get together and brief, and then either go out and do jobs if you had jobs on the books, or wait for the phone to ring or to hear something on the radio that you could go to. The kind of jobs that we would pre-plan is if people were going to do an operation, they might want photographs of a target premises or something like that. So we would go and do that. or if there had been a serious crime or a serious road traffic accident, then we might be tasked to go out and take photographs of that for the courts or the coroner or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. So those are the kind of things that were pre-planned. But then you were just waiting for, a car chase or a missing child or somebody to run away after committing a burglary or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm. Because I'm going to ask you a few questions about some interesting stories later. But what was the 135's range like? And did you ever have to go, like, if you hit another like county's boundary, was that you out and then someone else took over, or how did that work?
About 2 hours was our endurance. A little bit more in the day, a little bit less at night, because you have to have more fuel in reserve at night. Yeah. But around about 2 hours was your endurance. So we could reach the furthest point of Suffolk, which was Lowestoft, in 17 minutes. So we had plenty of time on task, in theory anyway. And yeah, if you were on a live job, say a pursuit, for instance, that went across a border, you would go across the border with the pursuit. You would just let that county's control room know that you were operating in their county.
Mm-hmm. And was there a good camaraderie with the crew itself? Like, was it like the military? You all got on and you all mates and stuff like that?
Yeah, generally. I mean, we had to spend 8 or 9 hours at a time in a porter cabin with 3 people. So there were times when you didn't fly because the weather was bad, or because sometimes in Suffolk because a job didn't come in. That could happen. So you put 3 people who are generally people who have got quite a character anyway to have got on to that. You put 3 people in a porter cabin for 9 hours for 10 years and see if there's never a disagreement. Yeah. But generally we all got on well. And even if there were people who disagreed on something, like the price of tuna in the tea fund, or it was something serious like that. When you got on the aircraft, that was gone because you had the job to do and you did the job. Yeah.
But obviously you mentioned Suffolk there, but where were you actually based? Was there an airport? Or did you have your own field? Like, how did that work?
We were on Wattisham Airfield, which by then was an Army Air Corps airfield. When we started out, it was Lynx and Gazelles, and then later on, obviously, the Apaches that are still based there today. Mm-hmm. Our aircraft was housed in an old Cold War hardened aircraft shelter, which was designed to take, I think it was up to 3 Lightnings or 2 Phantoms later on. So it was a big old, the hardened aircraft shelters. Yeah. So our little aircraft could look a bit lonely in there.
But yeah, as I mentioned before, I want to talk about some crazy stories you've got. I'm sure there's loads, and maybe you can share a few with our viewers of your time being an air observer.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there was one pursuit that we had when I was fairly early on in my service, and I was flying with the deputy unit executive, so our sergeant, and the new senior pilot. So, and I was quite new in service, so no pressure there then. A pursuit was about the busiest that you would get because there was a lot going on, and I was in the back. So you have to kind of guess where the pursuit's going. You have to give a commentary on what's going on. To left, to right, and so on, and say where they're going. But also direct the troops on the ground a little bit as well, and try and think about places that you can get someone ahead with a stinger to deflate the tyres and all that kind of thing. So we were sent to a pursuit up in the north of the county, and it was a little orange vehicle. I can't remember what kind of vehicle, but it was a little orange vehicle. And the standard of driving was just abysmal. I mean, I've never seen anything so bad in my life. Most of the time on the wrong side of the road, and just abysmal. How he didn't kill himself, I have no idea. And because of that, it was decided to call the pursuit off for safety reasons.
Right.
So the police vehicles backed off. But we could still follow him because he didn't even know he was being followed by a helicopter. So we continued to follow him because he'd have to stop at some point. And he did. He stopped in a little village up in the northeast of Suffolk, near the coast, and we directed all the police cars in. But unfortunately, by the time they got there, he'd got back in the vehicle and headed off again. And he headed off to a tiny little place called Walberswick, which is on the Suffolk coast. And he headed down towards the dock in Walberswick, stopped the car and got out. And there's only one road in and out of this dock, surrounded by water on the other three sides. So I said, don't rush. There's nowhere he can go. We've got him. Take your time, sort of thing. So all the police officers eventually turn up, at which point he peels off his top, jumps into the river and swims over to Southwold on the other side. And he's a proper swimmer, he's a Tom Daly. He really is going for it. And we watched him on the thermal imaging camera. And it's not that far. It's sort of 300-400 yards, something like that. A long way for me, but not for him. And all of the police officers in that part of the county were now in the car park in Walberswick. Now, it might only be 400 yards that way, but if you take Suffolk roads, it's a good sort of 7 or 8 miles round to Southwold. So he was off and running through the town, at which point our new senior pilot said, we're running out of fuel, we're going to have to go back to base. So on that occasion, we had to leave him and let him run. And we went back and refueled and came back, but we never did find him. But we had his car and his T-shirt. But
wow, so you yourself, the helicopter never found him, or the police in general just didn't find him?
We didn't find him at all, no.
So
obviously we knew whose car it was, so we went and nicked him later. But, and they'll generally come up again.
Yeah.
You sometimes lose people. They're going to come up next week.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there any really scary stories you've had, of I don't know, brutal murders and some maniac on the run? Have you ever had to chase anyone like that?
Not so much like that. I mean, we have been sent out to people who have apparently got machetes or things like that. I do remember being sent out on one of those things, and something fairly nasty had happened, something fairly violent had happened, and a bloke had run off. Mm-hmm. And I was in the back of the aircraft. We were out over the fields, and we saw a bloke in the middle of the field with something in his hand, clearly in his hand. Yeah. No police officers for a long, as far as the eye could see. So the only thing we could do was land on. And I was in the back. So if you were in the back, you were the person who got out. So I was the person who got out and tramped across this field. I took my helmet off, but I kept it in my right hand. I figured if I swung with that, yeah. Turns out, actually, it wasn't the person, and he was a farmer, and he was putting up fences. So I lived to tell the tale. And we did eventually find the person we were looking for, but by then there were police officers, firearms units, and they could go and get him rather than me hitting him in my head, so to speak.
And have you had any rewarding stories, maybe where you help someone and they've got back in touch with the crew or yourself or anything like that?
No, one of the things was we never knew what happened afterwards, really.
Okay, right.
We very rarely found out what happened afterwards. There was one where we went out of our way to find out what happened afterwards. We were sent out summer's day. It was about this time of the year, but it was the hottest day of the year. It was 30-something degrees and that kind of thing. And one bit of advice for everybody, if it's 30-something degrees, don't wear heavy boots, a dark blue overall and a helmet, and then go and sit in a helicopter that's been sat in the sun since 9 o'clock this morning. But anyway, it was an elderly gentleman who'd gone missing. And a lady in his village used to come in every morning to check he was okay and get his prescriptions and bits and pieces like that. After which he would generally go out and walk his dog. And she turned up one day and there was no sign of him and no sign of the dog either. So she was quite concerned. So police officers went round and they searched the house and there was nobody there. And he lived in a house on the edge of a village called Clare in the southwest of Suffolk, and they didn't know where he walked his dogs. So we went to the house and started working in an expanding square from that to try and find out where he was. And during the daytime, you generally searched just visually. It was often the best way, and then just use the camera or the thermal imaging camera if you wanted to look into an area that was difficult to see in. So we're flying along doing this expanding square pattern and absolutely nothing, and we start covering a field in a sort of ladder pattern to see if he's in there, and we've seen absolutely nothing. And then as we're going along, I was in the front left-hand seat. I happened to glance over my left-hand shoulder, and there was something white on the border of the field, on the edge of the field. So I got the camera and swung it round, and it was a little brown and white dog.
Right.
No sign of the guy at all, but a little brown and white dog. So we turned around and we went and had a look, and eventually we saw that this chap was at the edge of the field in fairly dark clothing and a brown coat. Now, the chances were he'd gone out to walk his dog the day before when she'd seen him. So he'd been out 24 hours at least. No, right. In fact, it was this afternoon, so 30 hours. Cold night, hot day. The chances of him still being with were anyway. So we landed, and me and a chap called Chris Wilkes, who was the police officer who'd been sat in the back of the aircraft, and John Atkinson, who was the pilot. We all went over to this guy, and he just said hello. He was fine, but he'd hurt his ankle and had fallen the day before, was unable to get up, and he'd become disorientated and he'd become dehydrated and that kind of thing. And he didn't know where he was. He thought he was at home. He told us, because Chris said to him, "Have you had your breakfast?" Because he was trying to find out when he left the house. And he said, "Yeah, the dishes are still over there in the sink," and that kind of thing. So he'd be quite disorientated. And we called for the air ambulance to come and get him out of where he was. And just, gave him shelter and that kind of thing until they turned up. I think we had water on board and that kind of thing. And the air ambulance eventually turned up. Couldn't find us, despite the fact that there was now a helicopter with flashing lights and in the field. Did eventually find us, landed on, bundled this guy into the helicopter and took him off to hospital. And we spoke to the hospital a little later. And they said that he was fine. He had a badly sprained ankle and he was very dehydrated and sunburned, but he was going to be okay. But another few hours out there, and that wouldn't have been the case.
Wow.
So those are the kind of days where you go, yeah, worth turning up this morning.
Yeah, and I wondered, do you actually take your work home with you, or can you switch off once you're done?
I could always switch off.
Right.
Because we went to look for people who had gone off in order to take their own life quite a lot. That was something that happened quite a lot.
Wow.
And sometimes you'd find them later than you might hope.
Great. Yeah.
And those could be, quite distressing things. And I know some of my colleagues that stuck with them for a while. And I know the first one that I went to, it sticks with you for a while. I kind of just, that was the job, and we did the very best job that we could do at the time, and the outcome was the outcome.
Yeah, because it feels like you had an intense job and role. You weren't, just, at a desk typing away. Like, you had all this, intensity. I couldn't sleep when I came home. I'd be like, oh my God, things were running through my mind. But obviously, you can switch off. But I want to move on, Adrian, because you've actually wrote a new book called Above the Law. Can you tell us about this and how it came about?
Certainly.
And if you've got it with you, you can show our viewers.
We've even got a copy. There we go. Above the Law.
Perfect.
And you may have guessed, it's about my time on the police helicopter. So it's, a couple of those stories and all of the other ones. I guess it was about 3 years after I left the helicopter. I left the helicopter in 2014. And it was about 3 years afterwards. And I was reading a book called Rescue Pilot by a chap called Jerry Grayson, who was unsurprisingly, a rescue pilot with the Royal Navy. And it's a great book, and there were lots of really good stories in there. And I was reading it and thinking, well, actually, I've got this many stories. And I've always written for magazines and things like that. I've written for flying magazines and things in the past. And I wondered if I had enough stories to fill a book. So I went through my logbook, because luckily I kept a logbook of all the things we went on, and saw what jogged my memory, and wrote them all down. And then I had a period of ill health in 2018, and it gave me several months where I could concentrate on moving all these stories around so they told a nice story. And luckily, iBooks agreed with me and published it. So it came out last year. It's nearly a year old now, but it's been doing really well, and people have said some really lovely things about it.
Yeah. So where can our viewers find it?
All of the places that they would normally get a book. So the usual online retailers, your local independent bookshop can normally get it in for you the next day or the day after that, or as can the big Waterstones and Foils and so on. They can get it in for you if they don't happen to have a copy on the shelves. But it's available online as well, or you can go direct to the publisher, which is iBooks.
Yeah, we often get a few messages from our viewers online. They always want a signed copy. Is it possible to get a signed copy from yourself, Adrian, if our viewers want one?
If you go to i-books.com and you order one from there, I'm sure we can sort that out.
Perfect. And I'll link everything in the description there, all the links to Adrian's book. But we've got a few questions from some patrons here, if you're happy to answer them, Adrian.
Go ahead.
Right. This is from Anonymous, they want to be both anonymous. Do you prefer flying in the RAF or with the police?
They were very different. It's really difficult. Probably because we had more live jobs, more real jobs. The police, a lot of the Air Force stuff was training for war against mythical forces and that kind of thing, which was interesting. But as I say, I enjoyed the search and rescue where you could go out and actually help people and that kind of thing. So flying with the police, every time we flew, we were doing something that I believe was worthwhile, whether that be locking up the baddies or helping people who were in trouble. So probably the police overall for the job.
And again, what was your favourite meal on board the Nimrod? Did you have one?
Yeah, chili and rice. It was fantastic.
Nice.
It came in little silver trays. We did a lot of eating. Chili and rice was my favourite. You used to start off with a tray of sandwiches while you were setting the kit up. Dairy cream sponge was a favourite.
Nice.
It was something that we used to brief when we were doing a briefing, especially if we were going overseas. We'd brief all sorts of things, and then occasionally, if we felt in a jovial mood, we would brief the DCS ratio, which was the ratio of dairy cream sponges to people on board.
That's brilliant. And the last one we got here, was the Nimrod a loud aircraft to actually work in?
Yes. Yeah, no two ways about it. It was a loud aircraft. It was a loud aircraft outside. It was a loud aircraft inside. 4 Rolls-Royce Spey engines, 4 fighter jet engines, and quite close to you. So yeah, it was reasonably loud, and obviously all the kit whirring around inside as well. Because there was a lot of kit in the back, and that's all making noises and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of personal questions here for myself, Adrian. So do you have any hobbies?
Flying. Can't really get away from it, can I? The reason I asked to talk to you a bit later in the day today was I was off to the airfield this morning.
Nice.
I've got a quarter share in a 1946 Aronka Champ.
Wow.
It was a lovely day to fly today, but we weren't flying. We were doing some work on it to prepare it for its annual permit to fly.
Right.
So I was sort of degreasing wheels and doing up screws and things this morning. But yeah, I love to fly my little Aronka Champ, mainly around Suffolk because it doesn't go fast enough to get many other places. And just looking out of the window, all of the sorts of things that I enjoyed seeing when I was on the police helicopter, because I'm really interested in photography and I take a lot of photographs, but I'm really interested in history as well. And you can see a lot of history from the air that isn't obvious from the ground.
Of course, yeah.
There's quite a lot of that in the book, and there's quite a lot of that in what I do, just looking down from my little Aronka Champ pootling around the skies.
Nice. So, favourite aircraft you have flown or flown in?
Oh, well, the Aviat Husky.
Okay.
I'm a sucker for small aeroplanes.
Right.
So all these, I've flown in some incredible aeroplanes and been really lucky. But a few years ago, I've always loved the Aviat Husky, which is like, for those who don't know, a big, modern, beefed up Piper Cub, basically. And it is a wonderful aircraft and massively overpowered and takes off and lands in no distance whatsoever. Beautifully responsive, wonderful view. And when the lottery numbers come up, that's what I'll have at home.
Very nice. One you would love to fly, either past or present?
I never got to fly in a fast jet. There I was applied for a fast jet, wanted to be a fast jet pilot when I was a kid, and I never got to fly in a fast jet. So just one trip in a fast jet of any description, really. I'd always loved to have flown the Harrier. I loved the Harrier. I thought it was an incredible aeroplane. So fantasy time, it'd be the Harrier.
Brilliant. And can we find you online personally? Do you have a Twitter account, an Instagram account, Facebook account, anything like that?
I think I am on Facebook, but I wouldn't try and find me there because I don't know very much about it. I am on Twitter, and I think I'm something really, really creative, like Adrian Bleese. And I have a website, adrianbleese.co.uk. That's about me.
Yeah, and that'll be all in the description below, folks. But Adrian, what a pleasure talking to you today. It's been brilliant and fascinating for myself as well. So thank you very much.
No, it's been fun, Mike. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Cheers.